What do you think people or shrinks should know about James Holmes to start off with?
That I'm kind of shy, I guess.
Why do people choose violence? It was an unusually hot day on July 19th, 2012 in Aurora, Colorado, a decently large suburb of Denver boasting almost 400,000 people. Temperatures reached 100 degrees that day, but as midnight approached and the weather cooled, a 24-year-old neuroscience student, James Holmes, left his apartment and drove to the Century 16 movie theater. He purchased a ticket to the midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises and sat in the front row. 20 minutes into the film, James left the theater through the emergency exit, propping open a door, and went to his car to get an arsenal of weapons: a Smith & Wesson AR-15, a Remington pump-action shotgun, a .40 caliber Glock handgun, 2 canisters of tear gas. Returning through the emergency exit, he stood in front of the screen, threw the canisters of tear gas into the audience, and began firing his semi-automatic weapons indiscriminately into the now blinded crowd. He used all 3 weapons during the attack, killing 12 people and injuring 70 others: men, women, and children. At the time, it was the most victims in a single spree killing in American history. The youngest of those killed was Veronica Mosier Sullivan, who was only 6 years old.
It was horrendous. It was a nightmare. It looked like a war scene.
Why do people choose violence? James had seen psychiatrists and other mental health professionals. He had undergone therapy. He was taking multiple psychiatric medications. He himself had been a neuroscience student after all, and was aware, both personally and academically, about mental illness. In the weeks leading up to the attack, James would work on a manifesto, a 35-page notebook written on a computational book, one that his psychiatrist would come to refer, based on how James titled it, as the Computational Book of Life. This book, part philosophy, part self-diagnosis, part plans and schematics of the attack, and perhaps most importantly, a full display of James' ever-unraveling mind, would be mailed by him to a psychiatrist shortly before the attack. The manifesto was released by law enforcement. I've read it, and we'll go through it in a video. A certain subset of people who carry out mass violence write manifestos. Why? Do they have a conscious desire to convey their ideas in a way they feel would not be possible without adding the exclamation point of violence to an otherwise Substackian-level sentence? Or do they have a subconscious desire to be understood, to be heard, and finally, and irrevocably, be listened to? The growing trend among certain media outlets, both traditional and some new media, is to limit or entirely avoid publishing the names and faces of people like James. There's a reason for this, and it's because a key motivator that is the driving force behind these types of attacks is attention. This is perhaps never more true than in the case of the subset that write manifestos. While notoriety may or may not be a large factor in someone's decision to engage in large-scale violence, writing a manifesto is almost a guarantee that one wants their ideas to be read for one reason or another. Perhaps they want a specific ideology to be promulgated more broadly, perhaps they want their unique musings to be taken more seriously, or perhaps they want the world to know the degree of their suffering. The reason, in each case, is undoubtedly variegated. Sometimes motives are mixed, sometimes manifestos are confusing, and sometimes, perhaps most of the time, it's best to not read them at all. Throughout this video, I'm going to use, and indeed I already have, the name and photos of the perpetrator in a conscious act of transgression. In general, I think it's immoral to do so, and I think the media outlets who do not show faces or reveal names should be commended. But this is a different type of video. Not only are we talking about a specific incident, we're also talking about the manifesto itself. And by doing this, I am, in some small way, perhaps complicit in the violence. Manifestos are written for a reason, and by reading them, we are in some sense validating and affirming that the harm caused was successful in signal boosting the manifesto, that the crime committed caused an otherwise obscure piece of writing to be thrust into the public consciousness. But with this video, I hope to justify my foray into this darkness. Hopefully, there's something to learn in analyzing this document. Hopefully, we can glean some insight into the question, why do people choose violence? The Computational Book of Life is dedicated to asking, addressing, and answering 2 questions, and these are on the front cover of the notebook. What is the meaning of life? What is the meaning of death? There is a unique symbol on the cover that, to my eyes, seems to be a combination of the numbers 0, 1, and a symbol for infinity. The symbol came to pervade James' life. We are immediately greeted with a quasi-philosophical evaluation of man. We get statements that life is precious and unlimited, but that after death, the infinity is redefined to zeros. We get some scribbled questions that seem to be the protogenesis of nihilism. Can a person have both no value and be ultimately good and/or ultimately evil in value? Why does the value of a person even matter? The answers are a bit muddled and difficult to parse coherently. These certainly seem like thoughts that were seen to be important to James but were difficult for him to articulate. What results is a mix of philosophy, angst, and mental illness. Thoughts that are not quite fitting together in a cogent fashion, meaningless maxims that feel they must have meant something to their author, but fail to convey much meaning at all to their audience. All men are created equal, and all men are uncreated equal, but in between there is inequality. James notes that people are created equal, but that injustice or inequity abound in life, but that death, the uncreation, is the great equalizer that makes us all the same again.
Can you give me an idea of what some of the things mean?
That's the kind of human capital idea of placing values on human beings. So I give them an arbitrary value of 1 if they're alive and 0 when they're dead.
Throughout the early stage of this document, James left numerous math-adjacent visual aids. Unfortunately, these graphical depictions don't really seem to add any additional comprehension, at least to me. We see a lot of scattered thoughts throughout the manifesto, but more than anything, we see a preoccupation with life, death, and meaning. We see quotes like, "I've spent my entire life seeking this alternative so that the question of how to live and what to live for may be addressed." We see the beginnings of violent ideation, but we also see a side of James that seems to have a level of reluctance in carrying out this plan. He made numerous indications of having struggled to make a definitive choice to take people's lives. He sought help from the University of Colorado's psychiatric department and was seen by 3 separate mental health professionals, including the psychiatrist to whom he would finally send the Computational Book of Life. He saw her 7 times over a 3-month period. She would later testify at his trial that he expressed homicidal ideation within their sessions. James also called a crisis hotline immediately before leaving to carry out the massacre from his own telling, in the hopes that someone would talk him out of it. Even in the midst of the violence, his behavior seemed ambivalent. He went through the trouble of booby-trapping his apartment with explosives before he left in order to kill the maximum amount of people, but then immediately told the police about this when he was arrested. This ambivalence carries over to the notebook at various points. I told you he mailed his notebook to a psychiatrist before he enacted his violent urges. What I didn't tell you is that he had actually mailed it 3 weeks before the incident. It was later found undelivered and unopened, a tragedy of simple bad luck. In one early section of the manifesto, he gives solutions to dying. It's hard to know if dying here means merely suicide or if it's a reference to his attack. It seems likely he had some sort of plan in mind to enact violence when he started the notebook, as violence and murder are mentioned from the very first few pages. Either way, he saw death as a problem and he gives alternatives to it. Ignoring, delaying, pawning the problem onto someone else, that is, borrowing someone else's solution that works, and love. We see the perseverance on balance that floods the notebook, as it seems hate was written, seemingly more hastily, underneath, almost as if it was an afterthought, almost as if something had to balance out the love. We're reminded again of the mathematical diagrams that seek to karmically balance life with death, love with hate, justice with injustice. There is a great deal of introspection in the manifesto. James diagnosed himself with a laundry list of mental health conditions: dysphoric mania, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, OCD, PTSD, Asperger's, ADHD, schizophrenia, body dysmorphia, 5 of the 10 DSM-recognized personality disorders, psychosis, adjustment disorder, pain disorder, trichotillomania, and restless leg syndrome. He then goes on to obsessively list every body part and trait and function he has any problem with. Concerns with his teeth, his nose, his ears, his eyes, his penis, an inability to concentrate, flickers of light in his peripheral vision, excessive tiredness, hypervigilance of his environment, hair pulling, difficulties falling asleep. And at the very end of this long and exhaustive list of his entire body, he ends, almost softly, with the final condition. Eerily, this part of the photocopy is nearly illegible, and it only becomes more readable when the brightness and contrast of the image is adjusted: an obsession to kill. We then get to a direct declaration of intent. In his own words, mass murder at the movies. He tells us he's been obsessed with this idea for over 10 years, that his mind is broken and irreparable. He attributes this brokenness to the reason he became a neuroscience student, but, rather poetically, notes that using something that's broken to fix itself proved insurmountable. He concludes by saying that in order to rehabilitate his broken mind, his soul must be eviscerated. He comes to the dark conclusion that he must face death, and to do so, he must embrace the long-standing hatred of mankind and overcome all fear. This is followed with a symbol we saw from the front cover, drawn below. It is here that we get to the bulk of James's philosophy, including delving into the nature of man, free will, determinism, and morality. 3 famous archetypal stories are analyzed with implied analogies between them: the creation account of Genesis, the myth of Prometheus stealing fire from heaven, and Faust and his deal with the devil. He notes that each story begins with an idyllic time, and then once knowledge is acquired, so too comes corruption. The text becomes more philosophical in nature, with the idea of the butterfly effect being presented, that a butterfly flapping its wings can cause a hurricane halfway across the world. Cause and effect is analyzed, as is the relationship between space and time. Things become more spiritual in nature as he states that we are all one, that division is an illusion, and that the universe is a single unitary preponderance of which we are each a part. This is a thought echoed by numerous philosophies and religious systems, and is typically accompanied with feelings of love, unity, and compassion. But something is wrong here. Something has become perverse, and his thoughts have led James to a polar opposite conclusion. He understands the need for unity, but coldly concludes, unity through nil, unity through nothing, unity through destruction. You almost want to reach back in time and shake him and tell him that that's such a black-pilled conclusion to reach, that he went in the complete opposite direction, that his mind is sick and that his philosophies become dark and malignant and is growing inside of him like a tumor. You want to ask him why he did this, why his thoughts went in that direction. Why, if he thought he had to die, would he take out other people and not even end up dying himself? But he's already asking himself why. In fact, he asks himself that simple question for 8 entire pages, the lettering becoming more frenetic and less stable with every pen stroke. The remainder of the notebook is filled with precise plans, logistics, practical pros and cons about various methods and locations, schematics, and schedules, all related to the attack he'd soon carry out. In these plans, we can glean a little information about what facets of the attack were important to James. He wants to target random people because he says, the cruel twists of fate are unkind to the misfortunate. This connects directly with his earlier thoughts on the butterfly effect and determinism. It seems he wants to be an active participant in this randomness, in this chaos. We see James wanting to remain aloof from some of his crimes, an attitude he continues to hold in interviews after his incarceration. He dismisses the idea of killing people in the woods with a knife and stun gun because it was too personal. He wants to remain detached from these events, and indeed, this is how the arresting officer described his behavior when James was in the back of his police cruiser. He then goes on to dismiss an airport as a target, both due to its substantial security, but also to its association with terror attacks. He makes very clear that this is not a terrorist attack, saying, terrorism isn't the message is, there is no message, which seems to be a clear nod to the earlier nihilistic comments about the meaninglessness of life and death. He seems to be driven by chaos in the truest sense. He wants to randomly kill and cause mayhem, and he wants people to know that he did it for no specific goal or ideology, but that they were simply the victims of the cruel vicissitudes of life. He did it for nothing, nil, caused by his own mental illness. He spells this out emphatically, as if he can't possibly abide anyone thinking otherwise, further making sure to say that correlation is not causation, and that his failures in work and in his personal relationships at most expedited this event, but did not cause it. He emphatically states that the cause is his state of mind over the past 15 years. His manifesto contains a final section, almost an addendum, that briefly lists his psychiatric history with professionals. He mentions some therapy he's tried and what medication he's been given, a quick-acting unnamed benzodiazepine for anxiety, likely lorazepam or alprazolam, and a long-acting antidepressant sertraline, better known under the brand name Zoloft. He describes these pills as ineffective, but notes that they give way to occasional bouts of mania. He writes that as the mania comes, his anxiety and fear disappear. No more fear of failure. He attributes the one thing holding him back to the fear of failure, and now that that's gone, he has no desire to improve, to be better, or to succeed at life, nor any fear of consequence. He says his primary drive has now reverted to hatred of mankind, a drive that was suppressed by the fear, but as he says, no more fear, hatred unchecked. His thoughts continue to descend as he talks about hatred and his issues with an even greater ferocity. He enumerates his problems one final time. No consequence, no fear, alone, isolated, no work for distraction, no reason to seek self-actualization. He ends the manifesto by further asserting his plans. Embrace the hatred, a dark night rises, the latter phrase being the title of the movie that would be playing during the attack. Once again, he signs off with a symbol we've seen a few times. This time, the symbol is in its individual parts, so that we're confirmed in our thinking that it's a composite of 0, 1, and infinity. This symbol would later be found drawn in James' prison cell.
One of the things I'm real interested in is the symbol
this symbol.
Right.
You have it on the wall of your cell,
Yeah.
and I see it in other places in the notebook, etc. Can you tell me about the symbol?
It's a symbol I call the Ultraception, and it's just that any problem can be solved with depth.
It is a symbol he has become obsessed with, a symbol that has become obsessed with him. Carl Jung wrote that people don't have ideas, ideas have people, and this symbol became a living representation of James' pain, his vengeance, and his inability to square the circle of finding meaning in his own meaningless life. This symbol became the visual embodiment of what happens when people become gripped with nihilism and misanthropy. Alongside the symbol and its parts is a crudely drawn picture of a window to a room that's on fire, showing someone trapped inside, burning alive, and trying to escape, an imagistic metaphor for James' own internal state. It's hard not to become cynical while reading James's manifesto. It is perhaps inherent in manifestos themselves to have a tendency toward the grandiose, for the author to have an overblown sense of self-importance, and this is on full display with James. To someone who is hurting, I can see how James's thoughts can be darkly relatable. Even though it's easy to look at parts of his manifesto and dismiss them as philosophical shower thoughts, it's also possible to see that there's a very real human being here who is mentally unwell and is trying to think about life deeply, and is coming to some very dark conclusions. I can imagine that perhaps James would probably get a sense of fulfillment while thinking about the attention his manifesto garnered. To think that someone is finally listening to his thoughts, that someone is sitting there asking, why did he do this? That all the spotlight is all of a sudden, for the first time in his life, on him and his writing. In some dark way, by perpetuating crimes, you make your writings more interesting, more pored over, more combed through. Would I be talking about James' meanderings into determinism and his thoughts on the butterfly effect, a thought experiment so popular that it became a box office hit in 2004, grossing almost $100 million and spawning 2 sequels? It isn't unique. It's not particularly interesting. I'm reading it because of the violence it's associated with. If I found this in a random notebook, my cynical side would be calling it jejune and sophomoric and pseudo-intellectual. But because it resulted in someone committing an atrocity, I'm automatically treating it with a weird, unearned sense of reverence. Part of this is out of respect for the victims, that these thoughts were thoughts that led to such devastation, and to dismiss them as pop philosophy seems to be trivializing their pain. Another part is out of sympathy for the perpetrator, a man afflicted with severe mental illness who sought help but ultimately succumbed to his depraved solutions to his perceived problems. A third part that is in enacting these crimes, a sense of seriousness is conveyed, a type of indelibility is added to the ink of his writing, cementing them, forcing me to take what he says as sincere. I'm unsure if I feel morally okay in doing that. After all, it sounds like a deranged incentive to only listen to someone once they've harmed others, and yet here we are, me the video creator, you the video watcher. The uncomfortable truth is that people care more because of the violence. If the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, never killed or harmed anyone, his thoughts about environmentalism and anarcho-primitivism would be virtually unknown. His manifesto would die in obscurity instead of being seen by roughly 18,500 unique visitors every month, almost 3 decades after it was published. After every horrific mass casualty event, everyone has the same question: why? And like almost every question regarding human behavior, the answer is complicated, multifaceted, and in some ways elusive, even to the very subject of that behavior. It is very rare, with the exception of ideological terrorism like Ted Kaczynski or the Islamic Jihad of the Boston bombers, that perpetrators can give a coherent, logical, and complete explanation for why they decided to cause the level of harm that they did. For people who choose this so-called senseless violence, their own minds become a sort of black box, impervious to complete self-reflection and introspection. And, like a black box recovered after an airplane crash, there seems to be a dichotomy between pre-incident and post-incident, maybe at least partially explainable by the pure unreality that is likely felt by actually committing such a deed. Almost everyone has what they call watershed moments in their lives. Moments or decisions or consequences that change everything and render their lives bifurcated into before the moment and after the moment. Maybe this is something overwhelmingly positive, like getting married. Or maybe this is something overwhelmingly negative, like getting married. Maybe it's a tragic accident. Maybe it's something that feels insignificant at the time, but has overwhelming consequences in retrospect. The phrase watershed moment comes from, well, a watershed, a land area in which water drains into a river system. It is a dividing ridge between drainage areas and controls which river or channel or lake that water will flow into. Once the water passes the watershed and flows downstream, it is defined into a new body of water, and it doesn't flow back. Likewise, it is difficult for people on the downstream side of a watershed moment to make sense of what their life was like before something changed everything. It is hard to imagine a larger watershed moment than was offered by mass casualty events. The actions that James took that day directly affected hundreds of people through death, maiming, and grieving. And those actions, of course, affected James himself. With the incident at the Aurora Theater, we have information from before, contained in a manifesto, and we have information after, spoken from James himself. For better or for worse, there were over 20 hours worth of interview footage released to the public between James and his psychiatrist, filmed 2 years after the tragic events at the Century 16 Theater. There have been 2 years for James to reflect on his motives and mental state, and there has also been 2 years for memories to become confabulated and for the gulf to widen between the person James was before the event and the person James became after the event. It is impossible to know how much this watershed moment of actually carrying out the violent attack has changed James, and how much of what he says is accurate. Unfortunately, whether it's because of the medication James is clearly on leading to zombie-esque responses and an incredibly flat affect, or the fact that there isn't much to introspect on in the first place, there simply isn't much to be gleaned from these interviews with regard to the notebook, nor James' motives outside of what was written therein. I watched many hours of James speaking to his psychiatrist, and it is my conclusion that there is nothing of value here. Either James has become incapable of giving cogent reasons for his actions now, or he was never capable of explaining it thoroughly in the first place. Throughout the interviews, I started realizing what the psychiatrist was realizing in real time, that we want to find a deeper meaning here, where perhaps just one isn't present. At least not one that's going to be gleaned from an incredibly narcotized James years after the event. But I think this is typical. We crave a why, and in most cases a sufficient why just simply is not available. And this seems more true here than in any other case, where James' express purpose was to kill randomly and to consciously choose chaos. Do we really think we can find order in chaos? It's easier to analyze James from the perspective that he's mentally unwell. This is important because it is an example of a fundamental cope that has made itself apparent to me as I watched this video. It's uncomfortable to me to analyze video footage and written content from someone I wouldn't give a second thought about had they not viciously massacred 12 people. It's disturbing to me that I'm not looking at the thoughts and beliefs of the victims. I'm looking at the thoughts of a disturbed individual who decided in a well thought out and dedicated manner to choose violence, and I'm signal boosting his name, his likeness, and his manifesto. It is easy for me to do this when I see him as not criminally responsible for his actions, when I view him from the perspective of mental illness, someone racked with mental health problems whose mind was sick. This allows my own mind to reframe him as an additional victim, the 13th person who died that day back in 2012. But this is a fiction. Yes, the mental health issues are undeniable. James is a broken individual with numerous comorbidities. Nevertheless, if his manifesto tells us anything, it's that he was cogent, aware, and chose his actions with cruel intentionality. He meticulously planned the carnage he would go on to cause through pages and pages of schematics and diagrams. While the defense argued during the trial that he was not criminally responsible by reason of insanity, and his lawyers tried to claim he was in a psychotic break the day of the shooting, his own manifesto belies these claims. He was examined by 2 court-ordered forensic psychiatrists, Dr. William Reed and Dr. Jeffrey Metzner. After full psychiatric evaluation of both James and his writings, both psychiatrists found that while James was mentally ill, he was nevertheless legally sane at the time of the shooting. His actions were found to be premeditated, calculated, and meticulously carried out, and the jury found James guilty of 24 counts of first-degree murder, 2 charges for each death, 1 for murder with deliberation and 1 for murder with extreme indifference. On August 26, 2015, James was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole and an additional 3,318 years on additional attempted murder and explosive possession charges. James is currently serving out a sentence, heavily medicated and under the watchful eye of a psychiatrist at the United States Penitentiary, Allenwood, a federal maximum security prison in which James lives and in which he will almost certainly die. I am unable to, in clear conscience, dispassionately analyze James and his manifesto as if he was merely someone who gave in to mental illness. James chose to enact evil. He chose to kill people. His mental health did not excuse him legally from his crimes, and it certainly does not excuse him morally. I think it's an easy thing to throw these mass casualty events into the bin of mental illness, but I don't think it's that simple. I think there is a very real darkness that exists within the human heart, a darkness that, if we let it, can overtake the good. I think severe depression can bring people into a state where they must contend with this darkness, and for certain individuals, if this darkness is fed and takes form, it will consume them and consume the lives of others. If there's a cruelly redeemable message here, it's that evil does have an ontological structure, and if evil exists, so too does good. After witnessing and investigating the Rwandan genocide in which 800,000 people were slaughtered in 100 days, Canadian General Lieutenant Romeo Dallaire wrote the book Shake Hands with the Devil. In it, he says, "I know there is a God because in Rwanda I shook hands with the devil. I have seen him, I have smelled him, and I have touched him. I know the devil exists, and therefore I know there is a God." It's important to remember that the devil doesn't have horns, and he doesn't carry a pitchfork. He looks just like you and me. The capacity for great evil exists inside all of us, an abyss of nihilism, of destruction, of despair. And if you gaze into that abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. James gazed into that abyss, and he let the evil consume him, and in doing so, he consumed others. If we think we're not capable of descending into the same evil, we have missed the point. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being.